Hi everyone, we're continuing our series of beginner chess videos here on My Chess Notebook. A game of chess consists of three phases. There's the opening, the middle game, and the end game. In this video we're going to discuss the opening. How should you play the beginning of a game of chess? Well, when you do begin a game of chess, you should always be thinking about the center. The center consists of these four squares. One of your goals is to put one or two pawns in the center of the board. Another goal is to point your pieces so that they influence the center. They control central squares. In order to do that, we have to get our pieces off of the back rank and into the game. And when you do that, when you move one of your pieces off the back rank, you call that developing the piece. So you're going to concentrate on the center of the board, putting a pawn or two in the center, and developing your pieces. Now, there are two different types of pieces. I want to distinguish between them. There are major pieces and there are minor pieces. The major pieces are the queen and the rook. They're worth a lot of points. Queens are worth 9 points, rooks are worth 5 points. The minor pieces are the bishops and knights. They're worth 3 points each. Okay, so in the opening, you want to develop your minor pieces first. You want to get your lower ranked pieces out into the game before your higher ranked pieces. So you need to develop your knights and your bishops. Let's talk about how we're going to develop each of those. Let's start with the knights. Well, the knight here on the G1 square has two possible squares it could move to right at the beginning. It can go to F3 or it can go to H3. Now, one of those squares is much better than the other if you remember our consideration of the center. Okay, it's much better to put your knight here on F3 because from F3 it points at these two central squares. From H3, it would not point to any central squares. It would point just to those three. There's actually a saying for this that rhymes. People like to say, knights on the rim are dim. This is the rim, the edge of the board. The H file or the A file is the rim. And knights on the rim are dim means that when you put a knight on the edge of the board, it doesn't have a lot of prospects. And that's because when it's on the edge of the board, it controls relatively few squares. When it's near the center of the board, it controls a lot more squares. In fact, this knight controls 8 squares, okay? Particularly 2 central squares. So this knight belongs here, and the other knight belongs here. Those are the 2 natural squares to put the knights on. Now, sometimes you don't put them on those squares. For example, you may be in a game where you have a pawn in the way here. In that case, it's okay to put your knight here on the second rank, and it still controls one of the central squares. The knight might move again later. It might get into the game like this, or even like this. So sometimes when you have a pawn in the way, you do move a knight to the second rank. But rarely do you ever put it on the rim. Okay, and the same thing on the other side of the board. If you have a pawn in the way there, you may put it on the second rank. So let's turn our attention to bishops. So you need to develop your bishops early in the game as well. Let's look at this bishop on F1. There are 2 diagonals it can be developed along. One way to develop it is to push this king's pawn forward, and that opens a diagonal for the bishop. And the bishop can move along that diagonal and get into the game. For example, this is an excellent square for that bishop because it points at or it controls that central square right there. Okay, sometimes the bishop does go here, especially if black has a knight on this square. And even when the bishop doesn't seem to be controlling any of these central squares, when it's attacking this knight, it really indirectly does influence the center, because that knight is influencing these two central squares, and if white removes it, then it's no longer influencing any central squares. So often this bishop gets into the game here or here. Now sometimes it's more modest and it goes right here, okay, or even there. Okay, but there's another way to get the bishop into the game along another diagonal. You could push this g-pawn forward and then put the bishop here. And when you do that, the bishop is on this nice long diagonal, and it's pointed at two central squares. So that's an excellent post for the bishop. There's a name for this when you put your bishop on the second rank in front of your knight like this after moving that g-pawn forward. When you do that, you are said to be fianchettoing the bishop. Here, I'll show you the word. Fianchetto. It's an Italian word, and it's got a hard C sound, so fianchetto. Okay. And you can fianchetto a bishop by pushing that g-pawn forward. And by the way, usually you want to push that g-pawn forward one square rather than two. And the reason for that is when you push it one square, it's being protected by its two neighbors. And when you push it two squares, it's kind of all alone out there and can be attacked. Okay, you can also fianchetto your other bishop like this. And that also controls two squares in the center along that long diagonal. All right, so that's how we get the bishops into the game. So what about the rooks? Well, the rooks are major pieces, and it's actually better to keep them back for a while. Let me reset the board here. Okay, it's better to keep them back for a while, and let me explain why. When I was a beginner, and I didn't read any chess books or have anybody tell me how to play chess, I loved my rooks because they moved in a straight line, they were very easy, and they seemed to be powerful. And so I liked to get my rooks into the game really early. And my favorite way of doing that would be to push one of the pawns on the H file or the A file, and then just push my rook forward and slide it over and get it into the game. Now that was a mistake, and let me explain why. Well, one reason is when I pushed my rook forward here, very often my opponent had already pushed this pawn forward, and then as soon as my rook landed on this h3 square, he would take it. So I would lose my rook like that with that bishop. Okay, similarly, you can lose the rook on the other side of the board if you try that by the other bishop, like that. Okay, but more importantly than that, even if you guard against that and don't lose the rook to the bishop, getting the rook out early is not a good idea because it can be attacked by your opponent's minor pieces. For example, if the rook is nice in the center here, nicely placed in the center, it looks good. Well, it's not so good because it can be attacked by this knight. And you don't want to protect the rook with something because black would be happy to exchange his 3-point knight for the 5-point rook. So when you get your rooks into the middle of the board, they're going to be attacked by your enemy's minor pieces and their pawns, and you're going to find yourself moving your rooks around a lot. Okay, so how do the rooks get into the game? Well, they often stay on the back rank for a long time, and all the other pieces kind of clear out of the way. And once all the other pieces move out of the way, then they can slide back and forth along the back rank. And if there's pawns missing, like there's an f-pawn missing here, then it would be really good to slide your rook onto that file where you're missing those pawns so it can look out here and influence some squares. Okay, so those rooks generally slide back and forth along the back rank. Later in the game, when some pieces get exchanged, the rooks can come forward. Okay, so what about the queen? How does the queen get into the game? Well, much like the rooks, You don't want to get your queen out into the middle of the board too early because it can be attacked. It's got such a high value, it can be attacked by any of your opponent's pawns, bishops, knights, rooks, and you're going to have to move it. And if you keep moving your queen around, then you're not doing anything else in the game, and you're wasting time while your opponent is building up his army and developing all of his pieces. For example, another thing I used to like to do as a beginner with the black pieces was respond to this move with this move. And my opponent would take my pawn, and I would recapture with my queen. Then my opponent would attack my queen with the knight, and I would have to move it. And I'd move it somewhere like here and call check, and my opponent would easily block the check. And then I'd move something else, and then my opponent would attack my queen again with another piece, and I'd have to move it again. Then he would attack it again, and I'd have to move it again. And meanwhile, my opponent was building up his position, and I kept moving my queen around the board, wasting time. Okay, so you don't want to get your queens out early, but you do want to get them developed. Now, the way usually you do that is you develop them very modestly. Sometimes you just put them behind a pawn on the second rank like this, or maybe like that. So they do often want to get off of the back rank, and I'll discuss that further soon. Okay, so that leaves the king. What do we do with the king? Well, the king's the most important piece because if you lose it, you lose the game. So you have to keep your king safe. So your king is not going to go marching out into the game like this where it can get checkmated. Okay, although later on in the game when a lot of pieces are off the board and checkmate is no longer a threat, then you can march your king forward, and we'll talk about that in another video. So you have to keep your king safe, and the best way to do that is to castle. So you want to prepare to castle by getting your pieces out of the way between your king and your rook, and then you want to move your king 2 squares towards your rook and put your rook on the other side. Remember, I have an earlier video on castling. So the reason you castle, there's 2 reasons. One is you tuck your king into the corner of the board. When it's in the corner, it turns out to be safer than it is when it's in the center of the board. When it's in the center, it's more easily attacked from both sides. Black can get to it more easily. When you put it in the corner like this, it's harder for black to get all of his pieces over towards that side of the board. But there's another reason you castle, besides getting your king safe. You want to get your rook into the game. Remember how I said earlier your rook wants to be able to slide along this back rank and post itself on a good file, like if there's no pawn here? Well, one way to do that is to castle to swap positions between your king and your rook, and then you can move your rook to whatever file you want. Okay, so kings should be castled, and they should be castled early. Okay, so let's put it all together. What does an ideal opening look like? Well, there are a lot of ways to open a game of chess, but I want to show you an ideal pattern that would be great to achieve, even though you don't often achieve it because your opponent is stopping you. Okay, so white would like to do something like this. Put a pawn in the center, put another pawn in the center, get a knight out toward the center, influencing central squares, get a bishop out, also toward the center, influencing a central square. He would like to castle early to get his king safe. He would like to get his other minor pieces into the game toward the center. So this knight is affecting those central squares. This bishop is affecting that central square. He'd like to push his queen off of the back rank, but not too far out into the game where it's going to be attacked. And then he probably wants to slide his rooks. By the way, at this point, when there are no pieces between the two rooks, we say that we have connected the rooks. And a lot of people say that the opening phase of the game is over once the players have connected their rooks. So you might say this is the end of the opening and you're about to start the middle game. But you might also say the opening ends once you reposition the rooks. Now, there aren't any pawns missing here, so I'll take one pawn away. Let's say that got traded off at some point. Then one of the rooks belongs on that file where the pawn is missing, so it can go up that file later on in the game, and it can influence all those squares. The other rook probably belongs either here or here on one of the central files. Sometimes you put your rook on central files because the pawns in the center often get traded off, and then the rooks are situated very nicely with no pawns in the way. Okay, so something like this. This is what an ideal opening looks like for white, or some variation of it. Okay, so what is black going to be doing in the meantime to stop this from occurring? Well, let's look at an actual opening from both sides of the board. Okay, suppose white decides to push this pawn, which is an excellent opening move, especially for beginners. I would recommend often making that move. And one reason is it puts a pawn in the center, and it also influences this other central square, and it opens a diagonal for this bishop. A lot of people say it also opens a diagonal for the queen, which it does, but you generally don't want to develop your queen too early anyway. Okay, well, let's say black responds by pushing his king's pawn forward 2 squares, or his e pawn forward 2 squares, for the same reasons. Okay, now let's say white wants to develop a minor piece. Remember to develop your minor pieces before your major pieces. So knights and bishops first. Well, let's say white takes this knight and moves it here. Excellent move, moving the knight toward the center, but it also has a threat. It's threatening to take that pawn. So black should respond to that threat by protecting that pawn. And one way to do it is to move this knight toward the center of the board. And that move is dual-purposed. It develops a piece toward the center, but it also protects the pawn. So that's why that's an excellent move. Okay, let's say white now decides to develop this bishop along this diagonal right here, so it influences the center. That's an excellent move as well, and it prepares for castling. Okay, well, let's say black decides to get this bishop into the game, also toward the center. And then white castles, like that. And white's doing a good job following all of the usual opening advice. So is black. And now let's say black moves this knight out, and that knight goes toward the center, and it attacks that pawn. Knights often attack central pawns, and you have to be aware of that. Well, let's say white decides to protect that pawn by moving this pawn forward 1 square. That's a good move because it opens a diagonal for this bishop. But another way to defend that pawn would have been to develop this knight to this very natural square. It would have been another way to go. Okay, but let's say white pushes this pawn forward. I wanted to point something out. Look at this bishop that's got into the game. Often I'll see beginners push the pawns like this before they get their bishop out. And now the bishop is blocked by that pawn. So think about that. Think about getting your bishops out before you block them in with your pawns. So let me go back to where we were here. Okay, so white's last move was to move that pawn forward to guard that pawn. Let's say black castles. Good idea to castle early in the opening. Okay, let's say white brings their bishop out like this and goes all the way here. Now that bishop is serving a good purpose on that square. It's attacking this knight. It doesn't mean necessarily white wants to take the knight, because he'll lose the bishop and that will be an even trade. But what white is actually doing is pinning the knight. Pinning it means keeping it in place. And the reason that knight is pinned is because if it ever moves somewhere, then white will get the queen behind it. So this move serves to limit your opponent's movement. It keeps that knight pinned. Well, let's say black pushes this pawn forward to attack that bishop because it's aggravating him and it's pinning his piece. Well, white might slide it back here to keep the pin on the piece. Now some players will play this move. Push this pawn forward 2 squares to attack the bishop, and the bishop moves away, and now the pin has been broken. Sometimes that's an okay thing to do. Sometimes it's not such a good idea to push the pawns that are in front of your king like this, which kind of opens up your king position and makes it a little less safe. But these are things we can discuss. These are advanced ideas we can discuss in future videos. Okay, let's say black decides he wants to fianchetto this bishop, so he pushes this b pawn forward 1 square. Now maybe white wants to finally get this knight into the game. Black wants to finish this fianchetto. And then maybe white pushes his queen up to get his rooks connected. And maybe black does the same thing. And this might be the end of the opening. And the players could also reposition the rooks and slide them back and forth. So overall, this is a pretty successful opening for both players. It's not the best opening. We didn't play the best moves. There may have been some mistakes along the way. But the point is just to illustrate what it looks like in general to open a game of chess with these knights on their natural squares pointed toward the center. Players have pawns in the center. The bishops have gotten out beyond the pawns, so they're not blocked in. The queens have not ventured too far forward. The kings got castled, and the rooks got connected, and they stay on the back rank. And this usually takes somewhere around 10 moves to do. All right, we will learn more about the opening in future videos. Thanks for watching this one.